Okay, welcome to our second session. My name is Knauth. I belong to the 1981 founding generation of Buko Pharmakampagne in Germany. In the 1990s, I worked at the Heidelberg Institute, then for tropical hygiene and public health, and from 1999 to 22, I worked in the Development Corporation of the European Commission in Brussels. Now I'm retired, I'm back to my roots, that is to say, Buko Pharmakampagne. So, and as I'm a retired person, I could not afford or did not wish to afford the entry fee to the World Health Summit, but I tried to link in electronically yesterday, and I note a quite significant difference in the opening speeches, in the opening sessions. The opening session yesterday on the other side of the road was about building trust, and there's always a lot of talk about partnerships. And today with Dave McCoy we were listening to concepts like democracy and accountability. So that, for me, was quite a significant difference. And we heard that accountability, we have to think about networks of power. And we also learned there's a lack of accountability of powerful private actors. So I think the topic for this session has been well chosen. To have a session about the question, who has the power, which health issues make it onto the agenda of global health, and what role do private sector actors play in shaping the global health policies. We want to do that now with two presentations. The first is on the pandemic treaty, on equity in the pandemic treaty negotiations. And the second will be on private finance institutions and 30 years of shaping or reshaping the global health agenda by them. Yesterday, actually, there was a session on the pandemic agreement negotiations, and David, I understood you were among the privileged who got into it, because even those who had paid the entry fee would not automatically get into that session. So what we are doing here is quite different. You are all welcome. You all entered through an open door to this event, and I hope we can have a good discussion on equity in the pandemic treaty negotiations. Equity as an objective is not in doubt. It's green in the pandemic treaty negotiations. That means everybody has agreed on the principle and the objective of equity and outcomes of pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. But the devil was more in the detail, in the questions on access to vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics. It was in the, as we know, as most of you know, in the Article 10 on local production, 11 of transfer and technology, and very much in the last 11th round also on PAPS, which means pathogen access and benefit sharing. So I'm happy to welcome experts, a lead on international law and this kind of international public negotiations. It's Pedro Alejandro Villarreal Lizárraga. He works at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Pedro Villarreal studied law in Mexico, and he is a research associate of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He has always also been a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for comparative public law and international law since 2017. My questions, who's got the power, for this session would be, who's got the power among those 194 member states? Is it one country, one vote, equal power? Or is there an issue about global north, global south? Particularly, we are interested in knowing about the role played by and the positions of Germany, the European Union, and groups of countries like the Africa Group, the Equity Group, which is very much about equity. And the second question is, who has exercised power not sitting at the negotiating table? Is it Big Pharma, the IFPMA, that have made several statements on the negotiations? Or civil society? WHO praised this 11th round about the morning sessions where there was always listening to what was called important stakeholders in civil society, so those who had finalized their breakfast and came in time to the negotiating table, had the opportunity to listen to them. Did they have power? So I think a lot to learn from you and to talk about, and I give the floor to Pedro or Alejandro. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Christopher, and also particularly for spelling out my full name. I know it's a mouthful, but I appreciate it nevertheless. And also I would like to take this opportunity to thank both Julia Stoffner and Pedro for the kind invitation to be here with you. It was really a privilege to be able to share my views on the pandemic agreement. And indeed, I will do my best to address the questions that you posed, albeit I now adjusted my talk a bit to fit in the themes that were spoken, that were presented in the first session by David McCoy, by Victoria Saint, and of course partly the presentation by Maria Gellen, so in terms of accountability, so what can the pandemic agreement achieve at all in this sense. But personally, back to your question, so who's got the power? And indeed, I'm at risk of sounding quite radical in this field. International law, but also national law in general, tends to be an instrument that perpetuates power relations. And international law in particular has for decades now been criticized due to be reflecting the interest of a select few countries. There were the norm givers and the norm takers. So in that sense, I must say, let's start with a positive note. And actually yesterday's panel was quite optimistic in its assessment of the prospects for the pandemic agreement. But I do have to say, despite the shortcomings in the process, which there were several, I can address them further, it was indeed, in terms of governments at least, it was a participatory process where it is one country, one vote. However, this participation, formally speaking, right, everybody had the right and had a allotted time to express their views. There is always an asymmetry between the delegations that negotiate. As you may well know, Geneva is one of the most expensive cities in this planet, and those countries that are already struggling with budgetary shortcomings in their national systems, imagine then having to support and devote further resources for these negotiations that are years long, and also with lots of input that they're not always in a position to fully grasp in a short amount of time. So it is indeed, although formally speaking, again, formal equality, there was no material equality in the sense that there wasn't a level playing field most of the time. And in this sense, I fear that some topics were, because of this asymmetry, not pushed further as much as they could have. I mean, it's always easier to criticize from the outside. I know the type of pressure that the delegations were under to deliver, but indeed there are some issues that were not fully addressed with the pandemic agreement so far, and it's unlikely they will be addressed in the next months. There is optimism in regards to achieving a consensus in the next few months, we'll see. But if that's the case, then I fear that some issues will indeed contribute to perpetuating the existing power structures that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I refer to two of them, involving different actors, especially but not only the pharmaceutical industry, but indeed the pharmaceutical industry is at the center of this power dynamics. First of all, in terms of the pandemic agreement, what we see as a lesson learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in the other legal instrument, which is the international health regulations, is every delegation, every state pursues one goal in common, which is to protect their population as best as possible against future pandemics. But as Christopher said, the devil's in the details. How exactly will they achieve that with the pandemic agreement? And here's where, of course, there's a divide. I would say the divide is not just north-south, it's of course multi-layered in the sense that not all global north countries are in agreement and not all global south countries are in agreement on a set of issues. Again, I mentioned two of them that are salient for these power relations. The first one has to do, no surprises, with intellectual property rights. And indeed, it is no surprise that countries with a heavy presence of the pharmaceutical industry like Germany indeed see this as a red line. It's not negotiable and it's not really, it will not be settled through the pandemic agreement how we can use flexibilities provided by intellectual property rights in future pandemics that do not make this fully dependent on a few select actors, right, from the pharmaceutical industry. And that's because intellectual property rights, patents in particular, grant exclusive rights to innovators, not just pharmaceutical companies, but also universities and even non-profit actors. And thanks to these patent rights that, again, are attained and are acquired, granted to these innovators whenever they successfully develop a new technology, an invention, a new medicine, for example. Thanks to these patent rights, the patent rights holders, be they companies, be they other actors, are in a strong position to negotiate with governments, with healthcare institutions, if and when these other parties, right, that pursue public interests, they want access to these medicines for their population, they want access to these medicines for patients, they have to negotiate with these companies. They may not negotiate, at least at prima facie or at first glance, with other actors because of these patent rights. They have exclusive rights, and law then, these rights that are to be protected, law then deepens these asymmetrical relations between select private actors and, on the one hand, and governments, healthcare institutions on the other hand. We're simplifying in the interest of time. But sadly, the pandemic agreement, due to a major backlash from a few countries, will not change this power dynamic. It will be almost business as usual. There's some encouragement indeed to explore the possibilities that intellectual property rights offer to some governments, for example, whenever they want to acquire medical goods, not just medicines, but medical goods in general that are patent protected in future pandemics. And so again, the pandemic agreement will not solve this. However, one possibility that we do see, and even though, as I said, this pandemic agreement is negotiated at the World Health Organization. We saw previously in David McCoy's presentation the role of non-health actors and institutions. there's a separate process taking place at the World Trade Organization, where the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights is seated, right? It's a trade matter. One can claim this is not just a health matter. Of course, patents are determinant for access to medicines. But at the World Trade Organization, we have intellectual property rights in general, right? Not just patents for medicines, patents for other inventions, copyright issues, trademarks. And currently there's a process taking place at the WTO to review the TRIPS agreement, right? The agreement that makes these patent rights internationally binding is now 30 years old. Before that, there were other intellectual property regimes, Paris Convention, etc. But this TRIPS agreement is arguably the most effective one in terms of intellectual property rights. 30 years after it was approved, one question was posed by the government of Colombia, and this is where so Colombia decided to do this at the WTO and not push it further at the WHO, in saying, where is the evidence that patent rights actually foster innovation in the healthcare sector? You know, we often speak to our colleagues in the global health field, and evidence-based policy making. Evidence-based is sort of like the key word in order to legitimize, right, any type of public or private action. This scientific basis, following a particular methodology that will inform our public and private decisions. So this seems to be a gold standard, but so far, after these 30 years, Colombia asks the simple question, well, what evidence can you show us that, private companies or governments, what evidence can you show us that these intellectual property rights have indeed contributed to an increase in innovation, to have contributed to, and this was another claim that was made 30 years ago, that to justify this intellectual property regime internationally, that all countries that would adopt these patent rights or these intellectual property rights would also have the chance to become a center or a place of innovation. Because investments would flow, because companies would invest in those countries that adopt these intellectual property rights, be they global north or global south. What we see 30 years after, I dare say, without presenting you the evidence, but it's safe to say these investments have not been equitably distributed. It is not the case that private companies have indeed diversified their investment portfolios and have created an infrastructure of innovation in many global south countries that would benefit greatly from that. So as I said, sadly this will not be settled through the pandemic agreement, but there is a parallel process at the World Trade Organization, speaking of non-health actors, and also on who is at the table. Of course, there's a strong lobby against this entire process, but some governments are still there pushing forward. So this is on one hand intellectual property and how it perpetuates these power relations by granting these innovators exclusive rights for a minimum of 20 years. It's important to state that for a minimum of 20 years, these innovators will have the exclusive right to sell these products, manufacture them, and do what they want with it. But the other fields where the pandemic agreement displayed power dynamics, and this is not a fully lost cause, but it's one that is still being hotly negotiated, has to do with transparency. And this, so transparency, in my view, is a premise for full accountability. It's not the end goal, right, of accountability, I believe, but it's how can we have accountability if we do not know what actually happened during a pandemic, for example. And this transparency has to do, among other things, with the contracts that governments and other institutions sign with companies, with innovators, in order to have access to those medicines. There's one provision in the pandemic agreement, particularly contentious. It was started off very strong because the people at the chair of the negotiating body, the intergovernmental negotiating body, were representative of both the Global North and Global South. And they included initially a stronger clause to make all, for instance, all public funding granted to these innovators transparent. Let's see how much funding is being given to these innovators to create new medicines, and then see how much it costs for us to have access to those medicines once these products are finished, if and when they're finished. And this was indeed, let's say, okay. And this was indeed an attempt, a bold attempt, I would say, by the Global North and Global South representatives. But sadly, this obligation has been watered down as months have passed. There has been reluctance to adopt it. There's still some weakly formulated provision there, but indeed, this is another determinant of this power imbalance through law, that we don't have access to these contracts, we don't have access to the grants, the grant agreement that these companies are getting to manufacture, to develop these products. So where does that leave us? Again, the outlook, I'm afraid this outlook is positive as it could. So in my view, besides some highlights and some positive points, I fear that the pandemic agreement risks perpetuating these existing power structures that we saw during COVID-19 if we don't push enough to change that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I imagine now that there are quite a number of comments and questions, but I would ask you to be patient because we want to immediately proceed with the second presentation, and at the end we will have an open debate where you can put your questions, and each of the two presenters will know which to pick up and which to respond to. This morning I saw a heading in Al Jazeera which said, "Poorest countries in worst financial shape since 2006. The world, says the World Bank. The world's 26 poorest countries are deeper in debt than at any time since 2006, the World Bank has said. And these poorest economies are worse off today than they were before COVID-19 pandemic, due to COVID-19 and subsequent overlapping crises. Today is not the first, or this is not the first time the countries of the Global South face crises, and including the debt crisis, and in the 1980s, and I know I am talking to quite a young audience, so in your majority here, so it's long ago, but in the 1980s, the response of the World Bank and to the IMF to those crises was structural adjustments to the countries of the Global South, and this meant that countries were coerced to apply austerity measures. This meant spending for health and education was considered as a consumptive expenditure of governments and needed to be cut. And then suddenly something very surprising happened. Unexpectedly, the World Bank said, health is not a consumption, it's an investment. And the World Development Report 93 was entitled Investing in Health. And this report gave 3 recommendations. The first recommendations concerned the determinants of health. And the World Bank said in 93, to have better health, you need policies for economic growth and women's empowerment and women's health improved. The second recommendation was upon the state and the role of the state. And they said the state has an important role to provide public health, sanitation, and to provide a so-called basic package, which was then the interpretation of the World Bank of primary health care. And there was a third recommendation, and that called on diversification. Sounds nice, diversification, but over the years we learned what that diversification of services meant. It meant doing business in the public sector, user charges for the users of public services. It meant privatization. It meant commercialization of health services, commodification of health, financialization. I stop with the buzzwords here. But a last point I want to make is I was working in the European Commission in the development cooperation since 1999. In the noughties, which for our German speakers, the Villarreal, at the beginning of the century, the European Commission would claim that their preferred financing modality would be budget support to support partner governments' policies. This has dramatically changed. Latest since the SDGs in 2015, they talk about innovative financing and mechanisms and to leverage private investments. I think I have dumped a lot of buzzwords on you, but we have an excellent expert who will give sense to them with us. It's Marriott, and she is coming from Oxfam. And Oxfam has been enlightening us over the last decade on inequalities in the world and inequities in health. And Marriott, you are the Oxfam's health policy lead, and you have informed us for a long list of very good publications on this topic. So please go ahead and give sense to the buzzwords.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and big thank you to the organisers and to everyone for coming today. So first of all, I find it very difficult to make any commentary on health at the moment without first thinking about the situation in Palestine and in the broader Middle East. I cannot possibly do justice to that topic at all, and so let me just say there can be no health in Palestine until there is an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Until access across Gaza for humanitarian aid, until the release of all hostages and unlawfully detained Palestinians, until there is unfettered access to humanitarian assistance, and until there is a halt to arms sales. So with that point made, my task today is to share my view that global health over the last few decades has been transformed into a playground for powerful transnational private financial actors and corporations. That these actors are getting very, very rich and even more powerful via exploitative and extractive investment and business models, impacting heavily on already unequal, under-resourced and under-regulated healthcare systems and services in the Global South. I will share my view that this transformation, particularly in the area of healthcare financing and delivery, has been enabled by so-called development institutions who appear to be increasingly driven by financial returns and the interests of private financial actors rather than serving the needs of people living in poverty. And I will focus a good portion of my time providing an example of all of this in the form of Oxfam research investigating the role of development finance institutions owned by several European governments and the World Bank Group in funding commercial healthcare providers in partnership with private finance in low and middle-income countries. So very, very briefly and quite crudely, I want to look back over what I see as 3 to 4 decades of development narrative, policies and financing that in hindsight has laid the perfect foundations for the escalating conversion of Global South healthcare services and systems into exciting profit-making opportunities for powerful private finance. And to really oversimplify, I see 3 main transitions in approach and narrative in global healthcare since the late 80s and 1990s that have served to erode the centrality of the state in healthcare financing and provision while supporting the rising dominance and power of commercial interests. First, Chris has already mentioned the introduction of structural adjustment programs led by the World Bank and IMF, in which conditions were placed on governments to slash public spending and introduce user charges, in effect commercialising the public health system itself. These conditions were accompanied by a bold neoliberal narrative about the importance of minimising government role in healthcare provision only for the very poorest and only that very basic package, and allowing the more efficient private sector to flourish in its place. The second transition, with economic recovery in the late 1990s, we saw emerge what some see as the golden era of global health. A lot of public money was mobilised, especially for specific diseases, including HIV, TB and malaria. But along with the significant sums, there was a transformation of the architecture and narrative that normalised the role of powerful private actors at the heart of global health. High net worth individuals and powerful corporations were given a seat at the table in deciding how billions in taxpayer funds should and could be spent in global PPPs, such as the Global Fund and Gavi. And at the same time, in the shadow of these global changes, health systems dependent on aid were being reshaped. Rather than simply create an enabling context for the private sector to flourish by cutting back the state, we saw increased emphasis by influential development actors on using public funds to directly finance those private actors via different models, including contracting out or voucher schemes, and later health insurance models under the name of UHC, Universal Health Coverage. Controversial public-private partnership models and private finance initiatives that had proved costly in high-income countries began to be exported to lower-income countries, frequently with disastrous consequences. And then merging into the third period, and the one I think we are still in, began around the time of the financial crisis in 2008. With austerity hitting public and aid budgets hard, we were soon being told that rather than reining in the excesses of uncontrolled, hypermobile private finance, which had led to the crisis, it was only by mobilising more private finance that we could ever hope to fill the enormous financing gap to achieve the SDGs. The billions to trillions narrative was born that said we must use what limited public financing we have to incentivise and remove risks for private finance to do development for us. And in global health, we saw this narrative already emerge by 2009. Bill Gates had provided the funds for the private sector arm of the World Bank, the IFC, to set out a new flagship narrative and investment report called The Business of Health in Africa. It was written by private consultancy giant McKinsey and asserted that an expanded role for both private finance and private provision of healthcare across Africa was essential to achieve healthcare for all. The narrative, full of biased analysis and unsubstantiated claims, with no reference to the risks of mixing profit maximisation and healthcare, quickly became mainstream. Off the back of the report, the IFC, in partnership with the Gates Foundation and other development institutions and private finance actors, set about establishing a $1 billion investment fund to begin directly and indirectly funding for-profit private healthcare providers across Africa. And these funds, and the number of development actors investing in this way, has crescendoed ever since. Now, with that massive oversimplification with many gaps, and I'm sure many alternative interpretations, I want to turn now to share our research at Oxfam about how this latest idealistic narrative has translated in practice. We have investigated over a decade of funding from development finance institutions owned by 4 European governments, including Germany's DEG and the UK's BII. There's so many acronyms in this sector, alongside the World Bank's IFC. The research, I have to say, was painstaking, thwarted at every step of the way by poor transparency and claims to commercial confidentiality. Despite uncovering billions in investments to for-profit healthcare, we strongly suspect we are missing hundreds of investments that remain undeclared. And our research was driven by two main questions. One, are the commitments to advance UHC and access to lower income patients being delivered via these development institutions? And are they upholding their basic obligations to protect human rights? The answer to both questions is a resounding no. Instead, we see the pressure to produce high returns and maximize financial transactions via a financing model devoid of good governance and accountability is producing disastrous results, both in terms of health inequality and also human rights. So what did we find? So in the hospitals being funded by the DFIs, we found many cases of alleged or confirmed human rights abuses. This included patients imprisoned in the private hospitals until bills were paid. For example, we identified cases of newborn babies being detained and a secondary school boy held hostage for 11 months. We spoke to a woman, Francisca, whose mother's body was kept in the private hospital morgue in a Kenyan private hospital for over 2 years because she couldn't afford the bill. Patients entitled to free care in these private hospitals were instead pushed into poverty by medical bills. Patients interviewed by Oxfam in India were unjustifiably blocked by corporate hospitals funded by the DFIs from using their government health insurance cards and were pushed into poverty by fees they should never have been charged. This practice is systemic across India and many other countries. Oxfam also identified multiple cases of emergency patients being turned away at the doors of these private hospitals because of inability to pay, including cases of children and women left unconscious by traffic accidents and many other cases. Such practice is not just morally wrong, it is illegal. Overall, we found cases of overcharging, unnecessary diagnostics and treatment, exorbitant medicine and exorbitant medicine prices are commonplace. In our research, and since our reports have been published last year, we have found out more from health workers in some of these hospitals about the kinds of pressure workers are under to meet daily income targets via unnecessary admissions, tests, and delayed discharges. We have been told how patients are dehumanized in the process. And at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, our research also found evidence that DFI-funded private hospitals were either closing their doors to patients when they were needed most, or charging exorbitant fees for ICU beds, running into the thousands of dollars, including in countries very badly hit by the pandemic, including India and Uganda. Some of these hospitals received additional aid funding via the IFC during the pandemic. For example, the Maputo Private Hospital in Mozambique charged a $10,000 deposit before a COVID patient was even allowed to set foot in the hospital. This hospital got emergency aid funding from the IFC. Likewise, a hospital in Uganda, known locally for detaining patients, also received emergency aid funding during the pandemic. And beyond the problems of patient exploitation and abuse identified, Oxfam systematically collected evidence across all the healthcare providers being funded by the 5 DFIs and found a pattern of investing in expensive, elite healthcare. These hospitals may be delivering the returns required by the DFIs and demanded by private investors, but they are inaccessible to ordinary people and are exacerbating inequality. We collected fee information for maternity care across all the private hospitals and found that the average starting price of childbirth is the equivalent of 1 year's total income for someone in the poorest 40% in the countries where these hospitals are located. We know that fees of $1 or $2 can block access and impoverish. Here we're talking about thousands of dollars. Our research found a staggering 80% of DFI investments being made in these for-profit hospitals are made via private financial intermediaries, mostly private equity funds. 80% of these are domiciled in tax havens and are characterised by very, very poor transparency. We already have a rich evidence base showing how notorious such firms are for siphoning wealth out of social sectors in high-income countries and driving down working conditions and care standards. Yet, this model is being exported with no reference to this extensive evidence base. And the DFIs make no effort to counter our findings with evidence of impact of their own. Information on their investments, why they make them, what they're trying to achieve, is minimal if it exists at all, and we found no impact evaluations in the public domain. In India, for example, the IFC has been investing in private commercial healthcare providers for 25 years, and there's not one published impact evaluation. So Oxfam's research primarily focused on the losers of this new, highly financialised approach to global health: the patients, their families, and the healthcare workers. These are the people whose power is being curtailed on a daily basis through exploitation and extraction, through lack of accountability and transparency, and via the impunity of healthcare corporations and their investors, including publicly owned development finance institutions. Because despite being presented with the evidence of these harms, we have seen no one being held account to date. But we must also never lose sight of the winners, and the reason why this unfathomable approach endures. The winners include the private equity funds, the managers charging undisclosed but exorbitant fees running into the many millions of dollars for their services each year, the private investors in these funds, and we know that it's the richest 1% globally who own 43% of all financial assets. But also the millionaire and billionaire CEOs of already large healthcare corporations who the DFIs are financially aiding in building ever larger and dominant healthcare empires via mergers and acquisitions, building their power to dominate national government policy making on health in their own interests. And I'll just close by saying that we are working with others to try and exert our collective power in demanding accountability, at the very least, and in the first instance, of these publicly owned and financed development institutions who are behaving so badly in the healthcare sector. We, with 70 other organisations, are calling for an urgent halt to any future direct or indirect investments from these DFIs in for-profit hospitals, and an independent investigation into the harms caused, as well as remedy provided, where harm is identified. More broadly, we know there must be a collective effort to challenge the growing privatisation and financialisation of development more broadly, but at the very least, we must fight to put guardrails around those sectors most important for fulfilling rights and fighting inequality, and that express the very foundations of our humanity, such as health and education. So I call on those development institutions, if any are represented in the room, who are thinking about supporting such approaches, to simply reframe and rethink. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. In the first session we learned about the dominance of neoliberal ideology in the global health scene. Now we have learned about the consequences of its application. It's quite shocking. I want us not to lose more time. I think we take questions and comments immediately now. I propose to take a first set of 5. And you must say who you are. You may say whom you direct your question to. And please raise your hand so I take the first round of interventions questions. 2, 3, So let's start with this. So I have counted 4 now, I think the 5. So I had the first one, I think, was over there. Yeah? Go.
Hello, my name is Veronica Thiel. I'm a freelance researcher in digitalization with a focus on health, so no affiliation whatsoever. We heard a fair bit in the first session as well around the problem of accountability and how to get countries to sign up to any sort of binding treaties, the lack of sanctions in the WHO, and you just spoke about the TRIPS agreement, the WTO, which I think, is there a possibility, and this is an ad hoc sort of thinking, to marry the two up? So say if you sign up to the WTO agreement on TRIPS, on the reformed TRIPS, or whatever, you know, trade treaty you want to sign, then you also have to sign up to a WHO accountability system, sort of to marry the two. Or is that the risk too much that it would be immediately captured and the health subsumed under trade interests? Thank you.
Thank you. The second one I saw over there.
Hi, my name is Pedro. I work for Action Against AIDS Germany. I have a question to Pedro, and it might sound, it's probably a very stupid question, and I actually have the answer already, but I wanted just to know, to hear your answer and how to deal with that and how to sort of work around that in terms of doing lobbying work whatsoever. So you said that there's a lack of transparency in these negotiations. My question is, why is there no transparency? So what is the reason? Is it corruption? Is it distrust? Are people too stupid to understand that? So what are your explanations on that topic? Thanks.
Was there another one over there? Or was that then it's you?
Yeah, my name is Astrid Bernardo-Dorina. I have worked for the Heidelberg Institute of Global Health. My question also goes to Pedro. Sorry, it's a bit lopsided. I wonder, on one hand, if you could give us a short update on what you learned at the session at the World Health Summit on the pandemic treaty, since many of us did not get into that session. You know, were there new insights that you could share? And the other one is, how do you see the two processes being brought together? You know, now concluding the pandemic treaty and the process at the WTO of scrutinizing patents, which is a long overdue development, but one that probably will drag on for some time because there'll be a lot of resistance. So is that going to stall the process of, you know, concluding the pandemic treaty, or is it totally a disjoint process now? Thank you.
I think you, although there was someone, yeah, you, sorry, it was you.
I'm Melissa, and I work for Doctors Without Borders on Access to Medicine, and I have a question to both of you, and a question to you, Anna Shorter, because I'm so not in the topic that you just impressively presented to us, which is, you said at the end of your input that Oxfam, together with I think 70 other organizations, are trying to call for consequence and changes, and I would just like to hear an update or how that is going, because I mean those numbers, they are so shocking that there must be some people in some ministries that, you know, take this as one of those kind of like examples where we do need to change things. So that's my question to you. And then my question to you, Pedro, in terms of the pandemic treaty negotiations, you said at the end of your input that if we don't try to change something now, this will not turn into a meaningful, or it's very likely it's not a meaningful power-shifting agreement. So I wanted to hear your perspective on what do you think we, I guess I'm representing civil society, other people maybe represent different groups in here, but what we can do, because from my experience of trying to advocate for better provisions in terms of IP, technology transfer, and those aspects. It's just to the German government, there's just no room for any negotiation. There's no movement at all. So I wonder, you have a different perspective and also different channel into those systems, if you have any advice. Thank you.
Now we have gentlemen over there as number 5.
Hi, good afternoon. Tobias Buko, my name. I have to admit I work for KfW Development Bank. I have a long history in public health, working with a lot of the organizations present here. A comment to Anna's report. I completely agree with you. I think this is shocking. I think it's long overdue that this was highlighted. I can say that, I mean, DPGG is not KfW Development Bank, it's kind of a sister bank with the same empire of banks. So they're doing different things, and they're not doing what we do. But the discussion in even KfW Development Bank might be replicating that model. So I think it's good timing that you highlight this now, and I've already shared the report with my colleagues, because basically the overall assumption is there's less money in development cooperation. There's less money in the BMZ budget. So if we want to continue working on health, we need to become innovative. And now the panacea for everything is we need private capital. So now it's on my desk, so Mr. Lupe, you mobilize private capital for us and you tell us what ideas you have. It's very good that the bad practices and ideas of our sister bank are now being exposed, so maybe we can avoid making the same mistakes again. Pedro, thank you very much for your insights. I have a question there. How much hope do you actually have that WTO will resolve the intellectual property rights issue after, for about more than 20 years, they have not resolved it? And I was involved in a lot of the TRIPS negotiations and Doha declaration stuff when I was still at MSF. Now I was hoping that maybe in the pandemic agreement, this is the only space where this can ever be resolved. Now they seem to want to make sure that the pandemic agreement actually goes through, and so they've taken this bond contention out of it and referred it back to WTO, where the problem was created in the first place. So how much hope do you have we can resolve this in WTO?
Okay, we have excellent questions and comments and a lot to chew on for our two guests. I would like to ask Pedro to start with the selection of questions you can find.
Very gladly. So thanks so much for your questions. I will address two of them at the same time because they're quite related. It's on the TRIPS agreement and its relation to the pandemic treaty. What hope do I see? Is there a possibility to link the two of them in a way that would somehow lead to a synergy, a positive synergy at least? So first, indeed, this review process, I don't see much hope for reform as such. I think the WTO for some years now, if not a whole decade, has been politically dead, let's say. There's no progress being made at the main political body, which is the Ministerial Conference. States don't want to budge on a number of things. Started with the Doha round on agricultural subsidies, among other issues. It's continued now, and for sure intellectual property, there's no movement there. But I do think this review process, as I mentioned, can shed some light upon unveiling and discovering, let's say, lifting the veil off of this belief that indeed intellectual property rights, it's like an article of faith for pharmaceutical companies that they're the main drivers of innovation. Yes, but they never offered any convincing evidence, and now that this review process has started, well, governments also will offer evidence. So at least there will be even more clarity on the public domain that this is really not the case. At least the evidence doesn't support the claim that IP rights support innovation and cost innovation. And on the other hand, with the pandemic agreement, to the other point, originally it would have been possible, some people said it wasn't legally possible. I think it was to say with the pandemic agreement we can, for instance, consolidate or establish that there will be a suspension of IP rights during the pandemic, and a waiver, as it's known technically. This could have been possible, I think, legally. The problem was the political will, the lack of political will to do it. Now, currently, I'm afraid it would be difficult on the other side to say from the WTO to push for ratifying and adopting the pandemic agreement as a condition, right, for having those IP rights or trade benefits. Yes, it's not, because of the same reason I don't see anything happening at the WTO, because politically it's not moving, it's paralyzed, I would say. And thanks for the question. It's actually not an honest question. Why don't we have more transparent negotiations and processes on the one hand, and on the other hand, I was referring to other dimensions of transparency. Where in international law and whenever a treaty is negotiated, the pandemic agreement has been more transparent than other negotiations, but that doesn't mean it's fully transparent. Unfortunately, treaties are negotiated often in closed doors, behind closed doors. One of the justifications, it's up to everyone, each of us to be convinced or not, is that indeed negotiators, delegations, will act differently if they're being in the public eye, because each and every single word they say will be scrutinized, not just by citizens, by the public at large, but by their hierarchical superiors, right? In their capitals, they might be subjected to some administrative disciplinary action if the government says, we didn't want you to say that. So in order for them to speak more freely without this constraint, I know maybe it's not fully convincing, these negotiations can partly happen behind closed doors, informally, through some coffee meetings, and this is where the action takes place. There are some arguments, right, not to have always the public eye over them, because otherwise they won't act honestly. But I know it's not convincing to many people, so it's not really, it's at the core of the problems with international law. And so briefly, what did I learn in the session on the pandemic treaty, and what hope do I have, what could we do still? So on the session yesterday, right, at the World Health Summit, the Global Health Lab, indeed I was surprised at the optimism amongst delegates that this agreement, the pandemic agreement, was close to being concluded. It was on the Chatham House rules. We may cite what was said, but not who said it, right? This is my understanding of how the things were discussed there. But yes, I was indeed, there was optimism in the room, which I hadn't seen before. Let's see if that really materializes. And would I think that the processes, the TRIPS agreement would stall the adoption of the pandemic agreement? I don't think so. Partly because most of intellectual property clauses have been removed from the pandemic agreement. There's some very general, broad formulation, but there's nothing really strong that will change things actually in the next pandemic. There might be some basis for governments to take some action if they want to, right, which they already have under TRIPS agreement, but there's no major change as such. And lastly, to Melissa Chavez, yes, so what do I think we can do? We can indeed continue to challenge this notion, this established and belief that indeed there's intellectual property rights can be touched, right? That because if we touch them, the whole system will collapse, and there will be no more innovation. Now there's an opportunity to come up with even more evidence that that's really not the case, and that indeed if governments don't want to do more, it's because really it's a belief, a matter of faith, and not an evidence-based claim. This, to me, is already an improvement. But anyway, we can only see what will happen in the next month. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Thank you for the questions, and can I just first offer my solidarity with MSF, Access Campaign. We've talked a lot about power and accountability in this room today, and MSF Access Campaign has played such a fundamental role for the access movement over so many years, and many of us are very saddened and shocked and angry about the changes that are being made. So yeah, just wanted to state that. And thank you for your question. In terms of, which was about, to remind people about what the update is on the progress that we've made in holding these DFIs to account. We published our 2 reports over a year ago, and we've had several meetings with some of the DFIs and no meetings with others because they've refused to speak to us, which is, just symptomatic of the broader accountability problems that we've talked about today. We've been incredibly disappointed with the response. We have quite a wide body of evidence about the harms being caused by these investments, and all we have heard in the meetings where the DFIs have agreed to meet with us, basically platitudes, commitments to follow up, talk to the private hospitals and find out their version of events, and when we've asked for reports back, they've been told they can't share anything with us because of commercial confidentiality reasons. So then when we go the level higher, and we've invested a lot in trying to reach the board members of the World Bank Group, for example. Some of them are more interested than others, but it has really kind of hammered home this, those broader issues that were raised by David and others about the inequality in our global institutions, and the fact that it's, the power in the World Bank Group, for example, just rests with a few rich countries, and the US particularly holds veto power. So while we're investing a lot in getting the US interested and horrified by these findings, we really haven't had the kind of follow-up that we want. What we do know is that this issue is not going to go away, and we know that there are more scandals, countless scandals, that will emerge from these hospitals, and we will do everything we can to amplify the voices of those impacted and to make it impossible for these institutions to ignore. And I will just say that in education, there is precedent for impact. Education coalitions have worked for years to expose the problems of the IFC, in particular in investing in for-profit private schools, about the inequality, the unequal outcomes, the high fees that were charged, the gender discrimination in these schools, as well as human rights abuses. And a few years ago, on the back of all of this evidence, the IFC was forced to make a decision to stop investing in for-profit private schools. So we're hoping to learn from the lessons of that amazing work by civil society and trade unions to really bring impact to bear on these institutions. Questions for me?
Time is over. So I'm not going to try to summarize this session. I carry, as I think many of you also would, still a lot of worries and questions outside this room after this very impressive testimonies and information. We have learned something about who has the power, and the next session will be on who should have the power. Let me just thank very much our 2 presenters. Enriched us and given us the opportunity to learn about the realities of who has got the power in the neoliberal world. Thank you.